All right. We are again studying astro-spiritual physiology, and even on the second day I'm still not qualified either as a physiology teacher or a spiritual philosophy teacher or an astrologer, but I talk anyway. We're trying to fulfill Max Heindel's request that people who want to become healers or act as healers study physiology so that they can be more useful as invisible helpers even if you don't remember it when you wake up in the morning. Now, Max Heindel often spoke of the mystery of Trinity, and it was the mystery of how the One expresses itself in three different faces, and how the three different faces are completely united in the One. Now, the attributes find expressions in the three persons of God, or the Godhead. The attributes being the characteristics or qualities of divinity. And the personifications that they live through are called the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, if you want to read a really nice little booklet, read the Solstice and Equinox services of the Rosicrucian Fellowship. And they describe this, how when the one universal spirit needs to act as a generator, it takes on that face. Or when it has to be a redeemer or a savior, it takes on another face. It's a very beautiful read. Now, the idea of unity being dispersed through multiplicity is not new in Western mysticism or in Christian mysticism. In the Orphic mystery schools of both Pythagoras and Plato, it was called the problem of the one and the many. And it was a problem of trying to solve or understand how the one universal spirit was manifest in so many things and still maintained its unity. It still is a problem to this day, especially in our very materialistic world, where scientists are so specialized to such a degree that they miss the greater unity. In our language, we have a saying about such people. We say they can't see the forest for the trees. Now, this is a problem in healing also. In the Gospels, Christ said, "Let thine eye be single." By that he meant to say that we should be unified beings. And to do that, one must maintain a strong presence of self, a strong spiritual ego. If we don't do that, problems occur. We had probably one of the best examples of the kinds of problems that arise when we talked about cancer this morning. In cancer, there is a rapid, uncontrolled growth in the dense physical body. And from the Rosicrucian philosophy, we know that growth is an activity of the vital body, most especially the life ether of the vital body. So if the self loses control of the growth function, the vital body is unimpeded, and it'll grow like a plant. It'll continue to grow and grow and grow as long as there's stuff for it to grow with. This is one example of why the Rosicrucian philosophy exhorted us to be in control of ourselves all the time. To not only be in control, but to be in balance, to have equipoise. Now, it would take us too far away, and it would be a little bit redundant to look at cancer at this time, just beyond saying that simple statement. But it is a very good example of the real need for unity. Unity of our entire being. In English, we say that to heal is to restore wholeness. Wholeness to the body, wholeness to the entire character. That is, that wholeness is a unity. That's to bring everything back into a state of oneness. Now the same problem of maintaining unity in diversity applies to the study of physiology. When we're studying systems or organs or even cells or tissues, it's easy to forget the whole. The human dense physical body is a whole. And in that whole, every part of it is intimately connected. So even though we're going to look especially at different things of the physical body, every part is part of a whole. And that whole is more than just putting all the parts together. Now, in order to keep this in mind, we're going to always double back a little bit and try to connect with the subject from the talk before so that we have a little bit of unity. In the talk yesterday, we talked about the Libra principle of balance, which in physiology is called homeostasis. We said that the body is constantly seeking many types of homeostatic balances. We said that the body is constantly being taken out of balance by action. When we do anything, we disrupt a balance. And the body is constantly trying to restore that balance. So we're very busy all the time going into and out of balance. And we also said that there are center points and limits to balance, such that if we get too off balance one way or another, unconsciousness or even death can ensue. We talked about the homeostatic balance of temperature. If the body temperature gets too high, we lose consciousness. If it gets too low, we also lose consciousness. Now, Max Heindel said that the loss of balance is the cause of all illness, and the restoration of balance is the goal of healing. Now, the Rosicrucian philosophy teaches this in terms of tones, because all of the bodies, all of the vehicles of consciousness began in the mind, and the mind is the body of tone. The entire physical etheric complex that we live in has a keynote, and every organ has a keynote, and the keynotes of the organs are attuned to the basic keynote of the body altogether. Now, in music, we know that a instrument can get out of tune. And if it gets out of tune, what the spirit inside of us that senses what a perfect pitch is or what a just intonation is, senses that. When a musical instrument gets out of tune, it is tuned either a little too high or a little too low. If it's high, we say it's sharp, and if it's low, we say it's flat. Now, Max Heindel tells us that when organs are overly active or underly active, the result is illness, because that disrupts the balance or many of the balances in the body. In physiology, it is called hyperactivity if it's too active, and hypoactivity if it's too slow. If it's in music, if it's too high, it's called sharp, and if it's too low, it's called flat. So healing, from this point of view, is bringing an organ or the whole body back into tune as it was intended to be. So that is a restoration of balance. In the book that Suzanne spoke of this afternoon, Occult Principles in Health and Healing, it is said that herbs are recommended to do this. Some herbs have a stimulating effect, and some herbs have slowing or depressing effects. I'm not talking about psychological depression, obviously. This is because herbs are part of the same evolutionary system that we have evolved through, and our body can recognize and work with the herbs and restore balances without introducing all kinds of nasty side effects, which happens with medicines that are not natural to our evolution. So, we are told in that same book that there are other ways of establishing the just tonation or intonation or the balance. Max Heindel tells us that Christ emanated, in the body of Jesus, emanated tones, and those tones rectified the body of the person who was being healed. It's something like the tuning fork effect, except that it is much stronger and it's much more proactive. All right, we have connected with the whole of what we're trying to do in these talks, and now it's time to get into the subject of this talk. And we always begin with talking about space aliens. The materialistic scientists tell us that it is not possible for there to be life in or on the other planets of our solar system. The Rosicrucian Cosmo conception tells us that every planet has life, but it doesn't say whether it is on it or in it. So we have a direct contradiction between spiritual science and material science, which is nothing new. But in this matter, since there is a direct contradiction, either one or the other has to be wrong. And resolution of this conflict is corrected by a clarification in terminology. It's easily resolved if someone says life forms like the life forms on the earth are not possible on other planets. Materialistic science does not differentiate between life and form in the same way that mysticism does. In fact, materialists teach that the outlook of a life substance has been a disproven superstition. It is called vitalism by them. And their claim is that everything that happens in the human body or plant or animal body can be explained completely by chemistry. And it doesn't need a vital essence. But as is usually the case, they're dealing with effects and not with causes. It becomes pretty obvious for all of their knowledge of living forms, they can't produce a living organism. Now, it's not our aim to battle with them. It is the only reason we're bringing this subject up is to be clear about the difference between life and form using the Rosicrucian philosophy as our aid. Also, we can understand that in the realm of life, the etheric subdivision of the physical world, life can live with all sorts of chemical conditions. So life can exist and thrive within planets. There are no problems in the etheric subdivision of the physical world. The Rosicrucian philosophy also teaches that our humanity has fallen more deeply into hardened matter than it was intended. So it's likely that our existence here as we are now is a correction for a very egregious error that we have made. So we can see that in some ways spiritual science and physical material science are somewhat in agreement. And the material scientists aren't completely wrong. It's just that they're talking about a material situation rather than a material and a life situation. The thing that we want to discuss in this talk is I lost my place here. Oh. The thing we want to discuss in this talk is the ingress of life into chemical form. It's a very vast and a very complicated topic, and we could write many books about it. In fact, there are a few books that have been written about it. In this talk, we're going to speak about one simple fact on this subject. It can be stated very simply. And in this, there's complete agreement between materialistic science and physical science, except for the etheric part of it. In order for a form to sustain life in the chemical subdivision of the physical world, there must be water. For a form to sustain life in the chemical subdivision of the physical world, there must be water. If there's no water, life in the chemicals is impossible. The Rosicrucian philosophy teaches that chemical forms that are alive have living vital bodies. Some of these vital bodies are very simple. A bacterium has an extremely simple vital body. Humans have complex vital bodies using all four ethers in various different ways. The one thing that all living organisms have in common is life ether. Whether it be a plant or an animal or a human, if it is alive, it has a vital body of life ether. Now, life ether has a very peculiar affinity. It has an extreme affinity with water. Life ether dissolves in water readily. Water is a carrier for life ether. We know that if we go to the grocery store and we look at the produce to keep it fresh, every now and then they spray it with water. And then that water helps to hold or draw in the vitality. You can bring back a vegetable quite a long way from dehydration just by sprinkling it with water, because that vital body wants to continue to live. It is through this affinity of life ether with water that the life ether is worked into the chemical form. This means that if we want to promote health and healing and to aid people to have better lives, we need to know a little bit about life, and certainly we need to know something about water. the adult human body is about 60% water. Newborns, the body is 78% water. And within 1 year, it's down to 65% water. As an older person, sometimes feels like it's below 50. Like you feel like your skin and bones and everything is turning hard. We're turning into minerals. If we compare the water fraction by weight, for women it is about 45% of the body. And for men, it's about 58% relative to the same amount of weight. Now this is a surprising statistic because the female body has that extra layer of fat. But the fat means that there is a lower percentage of water by weight. 2/3 of the water in the body is the fluid within cells. We talked about that last night when we talked about the balance between the sodium and potassium, the sodium being in the interstitial fluids and the potassium being in the in the cells themselves. So from this, it's obvious, in order to live, we have to have water. In terms of the Rosicrucian philosophy, if dehydration becomes too great, we die because we can't sustain the life ether to keep the physical body alive. Cells shrivel up and there's no life holding them. Too much water produces a distortion or loss of clear consciousness. Right across the street over here on the corner of Lakeside and Lake Court, my ex-wife and 2 friends lived in the upstairs apartment. And one of the friends was a farm girl that usually wasn't prone to exaggeration, but it was watermelon season, and she bet the other 2 people in the apartment that she could eat 3 big watermelons in something like a half a day. And she got the first one down, and as she was going into the second one, she was rolling on the floor like she was drunk, because it had washed out all of the minerals, so much water going through, and she was like crazy drunk, and you couldn't stop her from laughing. And she was lucky she didn't continue on with that, because if she could continue on, she could have killed herself. Now, in all of this, the fluids, either intra or intercellular fluids, all depend on the sodium-potassium balance that we spoke of last night, when we said that if you run a mile, most of the energy is not spent in the running, most of the energy is spent in the sodium-potassium balance. And that's going to come into what we're looking at this evening. If the sodium gets low, the body loses water, and there's dehydration. We said that sodium is a lunar element, and the moon rules water, and where sodium is where the moon and water goes. So that's a way that you can lose life. Now, in this talk, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the places where water is taken into the dense physical body, and the most important way in which water is absorbed. Because there are many ways that water is absorbed, but there's one that the majority of it is absorbed by, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Last evening, we spoke about balance in the dense physical body. That was because when these talks were begun, the sun was in Aries, and the opposite sign is Libra, and it's better to study inward things in the sign opposite the sign of the sun. And so that is for getting at the inner hidden side of things. When this talk was first given, the sun was in Taurus. And so what we're going to look at in this talk is Scorpio. We're going to be looking at the large intestine, or colon as it is sometimes called, and we're going to be talking about water absorption. Now, speaking mathematically, the dense physical body is a torus. A donut is a torus. It's a occupied space with a hole in the middle. And it doesn't, the space, obviously our bodies aren't shaped like donuts, but we do have a hole running from the mouth to the anus. And it's a continuous hole. So it is a torus. Now there are jokes among mathematicians. People walk up to mathematicians and tell them that when a mathematician goes out for coffee and a donut, the mathematician thinks that both the coffee and the donut are the same shape. This is a coffee cup. This is the hole. This part is all part of the surface. It's just a distorted surface. And of course, the mathematicians usually have something clever to say in a retort to that. And so we're going to be talking about the torus that is the human body. The dense physical body, the whole of it is the gastrointestinal tract, which runs all the way through it. We'll use the same kind of shortcut rather than using those long words. We'll say the GI tract. And the GI tract is lined with a membrane whose tissue is very similar to the skin, external skin. But the primary difference is that outer skin cells have more hardening components. And those components make it waterproof, while the outermost layer of the GI tract is water permeable. Thus, from the inside of the lips all the way to the anus, the body can and does absorb water. In the upper GI tract, that is in the mouth and throat and stomach, not very much water is absorbed. Roughly speaking, more water is absorbed the further into the gastrointestinal tract that we go, especially in the large intestine. In fact, the colon is, one of its primary functions is absorbing water. Now, the water that is in the large, if we take and drink a glass of water, it's the same water that gets to the large intestine, but when it gets to the large intestine, it's not of the same quality. It's charged with nutrients and waste products and microorganisms such as E. coli and yeast and all kinds of stuff in there. Now, obviously, we don't want to reabsorb the stuff that the body is trying to rid itself of. So we have a nasty problem. Scorpio always gets the nasty problems that nobody else wants. So, so the large intestine is something like a sewer. It carries water that is smelly and all kinds of unpleasant stuff. Now there are three different ways that water is taken into the body in the large intestine. We're only going to discuss one of those ways because it is the most important way, and most of the water is taken into the body in the large intestine using this way. And very fortunately, or this is one of those beautiful things again, the more I study physiology, astrophysiology, and the spirituality that goes with it, it just blows me away at how perfect it is. Because this shows very much the Scorpio temperament, the attitude of the hierarch of Scorpio in this activity. To say in passing, Scorpio is the sign of recycling, probably recycling more than any other sign. For example, manure, animal manure, is an excellent fertilizer, and it recycles into the next year's crop. Human feces is problematic as a fertilizer, so it's not pleasant to use, and it has inimical effects. And societies that use human fecal matter find themselves locked into cultural conditions that it is extremely hard to get out of. And the water that is in the colon is also not really desirable water. So what happens is that cells in the body specialize in different ways to produce the different kinds of tissue that are necessary to fulfill different functions. The skin cells we just mentioned before have hardening agents for our protection. The cells in the lining of the colon have two peculiarities. And each of these peculiarities has a purpose, and each presents the body with a problem. Now, one of the peculiarities of the cells in the lining of the colon is that those cells have, even within the cell, more sodium than most other places in the body. Now, in the talk previous to this, last night, it was mentioned that sodium is a lunar element, and potassium is a solar element. And both are found within the cells and in the fluid between the cells. But usually, potassium is predominant within the cell, and sodium and its family are more predominant between the cells. But in the case of the colonic cells, the sodium is stronger than in other parts of the body, or there's more of it in there. The cells in the colonic lining have more sodium than within them than almost any other cells in the body. Now, the problem is that since sodium is lunar, it has a greater affinity for water, which is ruled by the moon. And the moon is in its fall in Scorpio. Now, with high sodium in the cell, it is filled with water, and it's hard to bring more water in it and through it into the inner membrane where it can be absorbed into the blood. It is absorbed by osmosis, and that means an osmotic gradient that allows a container of low sodium to draw in sodium with water. It's called an ionic or a osmotic gradient. And there is also a pressure gradient by density of the fluid on either side of the cell wall. The other peculiarity of the cells on the lining of the intestine is their shape. They are called goblet cells because they are shaped like goblets. And on the board here, these are diagrams, rough diagrams of goblet cells. There's a reason, and not only are they shaped like goblet cells, their proximity to each other is much closer than cells in other parts of the body. In fact, if this is the inside of the body, and these are capillaries, and this is what's the water that's going, the sludge that's going through the colon, the goal is to get pure water through the cells into the interstitial cavities, and then it gets absorbed into the capillaries. This is what has to be done. Now, the goblet cells grow very close to each other because you don't want all of this scummy water coming through, because that's the poison, that's the crap you're trying to keep out of the body. You need the water, because if you don't have the water, you're not going to live. So there are these two peculiarities. There is the high sodium in the goblet cells, and there is the closeness of the goblet cells that doesn't let water through. So what are you going to do to get the water into the body? Only water must get through, and not waste and not bacteria or anything like that. Because if you cut the lining of the intestines, that's sepsis. You get poisoned, and that's it very quickly. So this is accomplished, the bringing of the water from the center. There are technical names for these, so I don't want to get into all kinds of technical names. To get this water through the cells and then into the interstitial fluid where it can be absorbed. All right. This is done in a very Scorpion manner. It is done by pressure. And pressure is one of the key words of Scorpio. Scorpio rules onions. And of all living tissue, onion cells have the highest intracellular pressure of all things. I think it's something like 65 pounds per square inch, which is why if you cut into an onion, it can spray way out because it's got that high pressure. There is osmotic pressure, which is called sometimes ionic pressure, and there is density pressure. One is due to the, this has more push because it has more gravity, and the other is because the ions on this side of the membrane want to go through to the other side because the other side has lower pressure. So first we have to understand what an ion is. An ion is an unattached inorganic atom. If we have a crystal of salt that has attached sodium and chloride, they're stable, they're bound together. There's a crystalline lattice, and there is no charge left over. But if you put that cube of salt into the water, and the water is not saturated, then it breaks apart. It only happens with inorganic chemicals that the sodium and the chloride break apart and they freely flow through the water. They're called free charged ions. Now this happens only with inorganic compounds, and it usually happens with highly reactive atoms and compounds. Sodium and potassium are pretty reactive But if you have something like lead, there are no lead ions because it's not very reactive at all. Now, because they are charged, they are ruled by Uranus. Uranus rules all of what are called electromagnetic charges. And Uranus rules freedom. So when the ions are zipping around in the water, they are called free ions. Now there are two places where ionization occurs in nature. One is in the outer layers of the Earth's atmosphere, such as in the Van Allen belt. There, the ions are zipping around, floating around freely in space. They can be brought together and united, but to a large extent, they're just basically free ions. Obviously, since it's in the air and there's a much higher degree of freedom, this is indicated by Uranus in Aquarius. But when the ionization is in water, as we have just been looking at, it is scorpionic. Uranus has its exaltation in Scorpio, and it is exalted there. So the astrology of this is beautiful, and the work that is accomplished by it is beautiful. Now the moon is in fall in Scorpio. The moon prefers the binding of Taurus, where in Taurus she's exalted. However, water is ruled by the moon, and sodium is ruled by the moon. So the moon or the water follows the sodium, and that brings us back to our problem of getting pure water to where it can be absorbed. So far, we know that there are too many sodium cells for osmotic penetration to bring more water into the cell. And there are too many sodium cells for there to be an osmotic pressure to bring it into the interstitial area. So the problem is, how do you get these extra sodium ions out so that water can come in on other sodium ions, but not as many? So this is a dynamic problem that they're constantly trying to get rid of sodium so that, and overdo it so that osmotically sodium will bring in water across the membrane. And this is accomplished by a Scorpio instrument. And that Scorpio instrument is called a sodium-potassium pump. And a sodium-potassium pump is an ionic process that does not use osmosis. It uses biochemical activity. So a sodium-potassium pump is a protein transmembrane complex. It's a channel. They're located in various places on the inside of the goblet cells. And they are channels, but they're unusual channels. They're a protein that has an unusual shape, and that shape depends on ionization. What happens is when the sodium pump is in state A, the protein complex is such that it is very attractive to sodium. And so 3 sodium ions go into the pump. And as soon as they attach to that protein, the pump changes shape. And it looks like this state. And when it looks like that, it discharges the sodium ions. So that it's getting rid of the sodium ions, but when it's in this B state, it is very attractive to potassium. But because of valency, potassium is different, and it gets only 2 potassium ions. And as soon as those 2 potassium ions attach, it goes back to state A, and the potassium is on the inside, and the sodium is on the outside, which is just what you desire. So it's constantly pumping sodium out and pumping potassium in. And as it does this, the water on the inside of the colon gets to be of such an ionic pressure, or osmotic pressure, it's both the same thing, that it can osmotically come into the cells. And the water comes with the ions, and that produces a state that it can also pass into the interstitial fluids. And once it's in the interstitial fluids, it can be absorbed by the capillaries, and this is how water comes into the body. Almost all the water is brought in this way. It's a very, very beautiful thing. We're showing it in state A, state B, but this is something that's continuous. So this is something really important. Now this is a very much of a Scorpion activity. Scorpio is the sign of rebelliousness. It's the sign of negative psychology. You say yes to Scorpio, Scorpio is going to say no. And it's of that character altogether. In this case, it is going against the grain. The pumps are going against the ionic and the density gradients. And that's just, there's almost nothing like it anywhere else in the body. It's going against all the pressure that is against it just to get the ions out, because that's what's needed for water. You have to get the water into the body. And so, it just blows me away. I'm having more fun with physiology than I've had with astrology and spiritual philosophy in a long, long time. So we see this is a constant thing going on all the time. It's going against the gradient, and it just keeps on and keeps on. Now, it requires a very large expenditure of energy to pump these ions. This is going on continuously. Whether you know it or not, this is going on in your large intestine, and you're pumping out all these sodium ions. And pumping uses a lot of energy. So the energy that causes the sodium to be bound and then thrown off comes from ATP. This is a little more technical than most of you probably wanted. There are individuals in life whose presence stimulates action and stimulates releases. We call those people catalytic people. They don't enter into the actions, they just facilitate or they instigate actions. And there is one, throughout the whole physical body, there is one compound that has this purpose in the physical body. It transports, that's a key word, it transports the means for other compounds to act and interact in the body. This is a mercury compound. It's called adenotriphosphate. This is adenotriphosphate, and this is its formula: C10H16N5O13 and P5, phosphorus 5. The energy or the process of chemical actions is called oxidation. And the oxygen that is carried by ATP is what is the fuel for the pump. So it's got to have the oxygen to burn. Now you can see why the sodium-potassium balance burns so much energy. And that energy is oxygen, and it's carried. And the carrying is a mercurial activity. If we read the Rosicrucian philosophy and alchemical works, there are at least two elements that are ruled by mercury. One is quicksilver, and the other is phosphorus. It's called, phosphorus means light bearer. This is the same phosphorus that carries all of the oxygen in adenotriphosphate for oxidation. So it is the carrier of the fuel for everything in the body, is an adenotriphosphate to oxidize everything. This is again why there's so much energy that is spent in the sodium-potassium balance. The sodium-potassium pump works so well that it produces this favorable ionic pressure, the favorable gradient, and that forces the cells to come back in and bring water. Now, since both sodium and water are ruled by the moon, the lunar forces bring the water along with the sodium, or the sodium brings the water along with it. This in turn produces this other favorable gradient to get it into the intercellular spaces. And pure water is carried then from the sewer into the capillaries. Very, very beautiful. But there are things that can affect this. So, to review, we want to say that water is brought into the body by pressure, and Scorpio is a pressure effect, and it is an ionic pressure indicating the exaltation of Uranus, the ruler of ions, in Scorpio. Now, this is something that we can be very practical about, because diet plays a large part in the health of the large intestine. If we eat foods that contain too little water, there isn't much water, and when water gets absorbed, there wasn't much there to begin with, and you have constipation. Or if you take foods that cause too little water to be taken in, and there's an excess of water, that is what results in diarrhea. So what is optimal for the physical body and for physical health, because you've got to remember, this is all being carried along by peristaltic action, which is another Scorpion activity. We won't go into that now, but the peristaltic action that brings an muscular impulse along the intestine, that's like a snake, the way it moves, and that is another Scorpion thing. So, the optimal diet is a diet that carries a lot of bulk fiber. Bulk fiber that maintains a gel-like state so that there's plenty of water there, but not too much, and it never gets dried out. And here we come back to a theme that's going to be in every one of these talks. We mentioned it 3 times last night, and we mention it tonight in closing, that the optimal diet for intestinal health is a diet that is rich in raw, fresh, green, leafy vegetables. All right, we'll close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love in Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. There are copies of the prayer out there on board for people that don't know the prayer. Any questions? Yes. Virgo is more the small intestine. That's going to be another talk later on.
Where did you get this from? What book?
I got this from the Book of Nature. This is alla Paracelsus. You're not going to find the way the osmotic pump, the sodium potassium pump, that you can find in any physiology book. And if you want to see, you look on YouTube, and there are all kinds of pictures there. But the astrological part and the spiritual part of what is done by the signs of the zodiac, you won't find that anywhere else. As far as I know, probably the initiates in the inner world know that, and it's probably where I got help in finding all of this, but you're not going to find this anywhere. Nobody studies this. And I don't know why. It's so important because you're learning how the cosmic principles work right into the cellular level of your body. And that's a really important thing. It gives you practical ways to live better.
And longer.
Yes, yes.
Where is the ATP produced?
Green leafy vegetables, high phosphate.
The ATP
food.
comes from your diet.
Yes, yes. Everything comes from the diet.
There must be some cells that make it.
Yes, that's another talk. That's on digestion. This is if I live long enough and I can remain cogent in my consciousness long enough, these are going to go on for years. See, I do these once a month by Skype with friends in South America. It's kind of rugged right now, the technical part of it, getting the Skype all lined up, but it's a ball. Because for me it's ideal because I can go very slowly. I'll state a sentence and then a translator will translate it into Spanish, and so you got time to think then.
They don't study it because they can't sell expensive drugs.
You're breaking the law by saying that.
There's somebody here that's going to arrest me.
Yes.
But it's true.
The Roundup, which is major ingredient in glyphosate, is supposed to affect the lining of the intestine
Yes.
to act differently.
Yes. Actually, the large intestine is shaped like this. This is called the ascending, and it's called the near colon. And there's the transverse colon, and then the distal or the sigmoid colon is the part that goes down, and then it goes to the rectum, and from the rectum to the anus.
And in the eye, when you have the dark spot, when you see this shape,
Yes.
The stomach ring, instead of seeing it around like this, you see it scoop like this. That means that they've got a dropped
Oh, yes.
transverse.
Okay.
And if there's a little pocket that bulges out here, that means that there's like a parasitic pocket.
Oh, good.
You know, I have a picture of pistons pumping in it.
No, this is a chemical pump.
I wonder if there's anything mechanical.
There is mechanical. It changes shape. It's like different atoms have different valences, and when they connect together, they change the shape of the molecule. And it's a protein molecule that changes shape. And then when the potassium comes in from the other other direction, it changes back again. So there is something physical to it, but the physical part isn't what's doing the pumping. It's the ionic part that is doing the pumping. You guys up for walking? I'm going to drop these folks off at their hotel, and I'll meet you up there.
I can drop them off.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Go on your trip.
Even
Did you get a new car?
No, I didn't use my car. I used my daughter's.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I brought